My husband did not give his mistress a ring. He handed her the key to the townhouse I secretly chose for our marriage, right during our 10th anniversary gala before Boston's elite. I did not cry or make a scene. I just smiled, placed my gift on the property file, and walked out. His greatest mistake was not the betrayal itself. It was using my financial records and digital footprint to build a home for another woman. My name is Harper Chapman. At 35 years old, I had spent a decade mastering the art of controlled variables. As the founder of Chapman Risk Advisory, my entire career was built on intellect, discipline, and the meticulous dissection of financial liabilities. I dealt in cold, hard data. My husband, Grant Whitmore, dealt in illusions. Tonight was supposed to be the convergence of our two worlds, a grand gala in Boston's Seaport District to celebrate our 10-year wedding anniversary. The ballroom was a masterpiece of corporate elegance and old money whispers. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the dark, churning waters of the harbor, while inside, hundreds of floating candles cast a warm, deceptive glow over the city's elite. Investors, venture capitalists, high society friends, and both sides of our families filled the room. Waiters in pristine white jackets circled with trays of vintage champagne. It was an expensive tableau, meticulously curated to project an image of absolute invincibility. For 10 years, I had believed we were building an unbreakable partnership. I handled the foundation, ensuring our financial and professional bedrock was impenetrable, while Grant acted as the gleaming facade, securing flashy connections and delivering charismatic speeches that charmed investors out of millions. I stood near the ice sculpture, feeling the weight of the silver clutch in my hands. Inside it rested my anniversary gift for him, a custom-engraved fountain pen made of brushed platinum, intended to sign our next decade of shared triumphs. I watched Grant weave through the crowd. He was in his element, teeth flashing, clapping the shoulders of tech billionaires and real estate moguls. I felt a quiet, steady pride. 10 years. We had survived the grueling early days of our respective startups, the sleepless nights, the relentless pressure of Boston's cutthroat business ecosystem. We had arrived. When the gentle tapping of a silver spoon against a crystal flute echoed through the ballroom, a hush fell over the crowd. Grant stood at the center of the low stage, adjusting his tuxedo jacket with that practiced, effortless grace. The spotlight caught his profile, highlighting the sharp jawline and the charming smile that had initially drawn me to him a decade ago. "Ladies and gentlemen, family, and esteemed colleagues," Grant began, his voice deep and resonant, expertly modulated to project both authority and warmth. 10 years, it is a milestone that demands reflection. A decade of growth, of navigating storms, of building something that transcends the ordinary. I offered a small, polite smile, expecting the narrative to pivot toward our shared history, toward the sacrifices we had both made. That was the script. That was the expectation. But Grant paused. His gaze drifted past me, sliding over my head toward a cluster of tables near the front. "When I look back at the past 12 months," Grant continued, the warmth in his voice taking on a strangely intimate timbre, "I realize that true success is impossible without someone who fundamentally understands your drive. Someone who sees the architecture of your ambition and does not try to rein it in, but instead helps you build it higher." A subtle ripple of confusion moved through the crowd closest to me. Wives glanced at their husbands. A senior partner at a white shoe law firm tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. Grant's tone had shifted. It was no longer the sweeping, inclusive cadence of a husband giving an anniversary toast. It was a targeted, deeply personal declaration. "Over the last year, my company faced unprecedented challenges and undertook massive expansions," Grant said, his eyes now locked onto a specific chair. "And through it all, there was one person who anchored my vision, one person who understood me best, a person who believed in my ultimate potential when no one else dared to." He extended a hand toward the front row. "Paige, please come up here." The silence that descended upon the ballroom was not sudden. It was a slow, suffocating frost. I stood completely still. Paige Holloway, 29 years old, Grant's director of partnerships. She stood up from her seat, smoothing down the emerald silk of her designer gown. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide with a perfectly rehearsed mixture of surprise and adoration. I watched her walk toward the stage, the rhythmic clicking of her stilettos sounding like a metronome ticking down the final seconds of my marriage. Every eye in the room darted between the stage and the shadowy corner where I stood. The investors, the board members, the society gossips, they all felt the drop in barometric pressure. This was not a tribute to a wife. This was an execution. Paige stepped up beside Grant. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture so possessive and intimate it made the air in the room feel heavy and toxic. He motioned to his assistant, who quickly stepped out from the wings carrying a long, polished mahogany box. "Some milestones require more than words," Grant announced, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "They require a foundation, a space to cultivate the next chapter. Paige, for your unwavering loyalty, your brilliant mind, and for being the catalyst for my greatest achievements, I want to present you with a symbol of our new future." Grant opened the wooden box. Nestled inside on a bed of black velvet was an antique brass key, heavy and ornate, resting beside a thick leather-bound folio. My breath stopped, but my face remained an impassive mask. I recognized the embossed logo on the folio. I recognized the shape of that key. It was the Beacon Hill townhouse, the historic, ivy-draped brownstone with the wrought iron balconies and the hidden courtyard. The exact property I had secretly toured 3 weeks ago, quietly negotiating with the broker to secure it as the ultimate anniversary surprise for my husband. It was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate, calculated theft of my intention. Before the entire assembly of Boston's financial and social elite, Grant lifted the folio, the keys to the Beacon Hill property, a new headquarters for our joint ventures, and a home for the incredible vision we are going to build together. The silence was absolute. No one breathed. The sheer audacity of the public humiliation paralyzed the room. Then, a sharp, rhythmic sound shattered the quiet. Clapping, I looked toward the front row. Elaine Whitmore, Grant's mother, sat perfectly straight in her beaded silver dress. She was clapping. A smug, deeply satisfied smile stretched across her powdered face. She nodded encouragingly at Paige. Elaine had known. She had likely helped orchestrate this very moment, relishing the opportunity to replace the cold, calculating daughter-in-law with a younger, more malleable understudy. A hot flash of adrenaline surged through my veins, but years of crisis management kicked in instantly. The primitive urge to scream, to throw my champagne glass, to storm the stage and tear the emerald silk from Paige's shoulders was buried under a glacier of pure, crystalline logic. If I reacted with hysteria, I would become the crazy, spurned wife. I would give them the dramatic climax they had engineered. I refused to be a participant in their theater. I unclasped my silver clutch. I withdrew the platinum fountain pen, its cool metal grounding me in the present reality. I stepped out of the shadows. The crowd parted for me instinctively, stepping back as if I were radioactive. The murmur of whispered shock died in my wake. I walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the stage. I did not rush. I kept my shoulders back, my chin level, my expression completely unreadable. Grant saw me approaching, and for a fraction of a second, the charismatic facade slipped. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his eyes. He had expected me to flee in tears or erupt in a rage that he could easily dismiss as unhinged. He had not prepared for absolute, silent control. I ascended the 3 low steps to the stage. Paige shrank back slightly, her hand instinctively clutching the mahogany box. I ignored her entirely. She was a symptom, not the disease. I stopped in front of Grant. I did not speak a single word. I simply looked at him. I looked past the tailored tuxedo and the charming smile, staring directly into the shallow, hollow core of the man I had spent a decade building up. I held his gaze until he was forced to look away, a microscopic concession of defeat. With slow, deliberate precision. I reached out. I bypassed the antique key and gently placed the engraved platinum fountain pen directly on top of the Beacon Hill property folio. The heavy metal made a dull, final thud against the leather. I gave him one last look, a silent promise of absolute destruction, turned on my heel, and walked away. I descended the stage and walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not look at the investors. I did not look at Elaine Whitmore, whose clapping had abruptly ceased. I just kept walking, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor, loud and steady in the deathly quiet room. I pushed through the heavy brass handles of the venue's main exit. The cold Atlantic wind hit my face the moment the thick glass doors sealed shut behind me, muting the world I had just left behind. Standing alone under the harsh amber glow of the streetlights, the reality of the night settled into my bones. My marriage had not ended because of a cliché office romance. It had ended because Grant had decided to weaponize his infidelity. He had turned his betrayal into a public exhibition designed to crush my dignity, elevate his ego, and establish his dominance before the very people I did business with. But as the valet pulled my car up to the curb, a different, far more dangerous thought crystallized in my mind. The Beacon Hill townhouse was expensive, millions of dollars expensive. Grant's personal liquidity did not match that purchase price without triggering alerts I would have seen. His greatest mistake was not the betrayal itself. It was using my financial records, my professional credibility, and my digital footprint to build a home for another woman, and I was going to tear it all down to the studs. The leather seat of the town car was freezing against my bare shoulders. My phone illuminated the dark cabin, vibrating relentlessly in the cup holder. The caller ID flashed the same name 5 times in a row, Elaine Whitmore. When I did not answer, the voicemails began to populate, one after another. I connected the device to the car's Bluetooth system, tapping the screen to play the audio, not out of masochism, but out of forensic curiosity. Elaine's voice filled the quiet space, dripping with aristocratic condescension. "Harper, you are behaving like a petulant child. Grant is attempting to secure a massive partnership, and you are throwing a tantrum over a piece of real estate. You have exactly 15 minutes to tell your driver to turn around, walk back into that ballroom, and apologize to him and Paige for your utterly classless display. Do not ruin this family's evening because you do not know how to handle high society dynamics." She left 3 more messages in the span of 10 minutes, escalating from passive-aggressive disappointment to outright threats regarding my professional reputation. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the familiar sting of a daughter-in-law desperately trying to be enough. Instead, I tapped the export button. I stored every audio file in an encrypted, date-stamped folder on my secure cloud drive and marked it as Exhibit A. A decade in risk management had taught me that arrogant people almost always trap themselves with their own words. They document their own malice because they are too confident to believe they will ever face consequences. Elaine was confirming that the entire spectacle was premeditated, and her complicity was now a matter of digital record. The moment the driver pulled up to our estate, I bypassed the grand foyer and walked straight into my private office. I did not bother to take off my gown or unpin my hair. The heavy silk pooled around the wheels of my leather chair as I woke up my multi-monitor workstation. The adrenaline was a cold, sharp current humming beneath my skin. I opened my encrypted browser and accessed our shared domestic server, bypassing the primary inbox and digging straight into the archived and filtered folders. Grant was sloppy. He relied on his charm to cover his tracks, rarely double-checking his digital exhaust. It took me less than 12 minutes to find what I was looking for. Caught in a secondary spam filter was an automated notification from a boutique private lending firm based in Manhattan. The subject line read, "Bridge loan approval documents ready for signature." I downloaded the attached packet. It was 140 pages long. I scrolled past the cover sheet, past the property disclosures for the Beacon Hill townhouse, straight to the financial annex. What I saw made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It was not just Grant's name on the application. Attached to the underwriting file were my personal financial statements, my tax returns from the last 3 years, the profit and loss statements from Chapman Risk Advisory, summaries of my diversified stock portfolios and municipal bonds. Grant had submitted a joint borrower application, utilizing my flawless credit score and substantial liquid assets to secure the loan. He was leveraging my hard-earned wealth to buy a multi-million-dollar love nest for his mistress, acting as though I had silently backed the transaction. He had essentially stolen my financial identity. I picked up my phone and dialed my private wealth manager. It was 11:45 at night, but a client of my tier did not wait for business hours. He picked up on the third ring. "Marcus," I said, my voice entirely devoid of inflection, "I need you to place an immediate, hard freeze on all of my personal and business accounts. Initiate a maximum level fraud alert across all 3 major credit bureaus. Flag any pending inquiries, specifically anything related to real estate bridge loans or private equity lending. Harper, it is nearly midnight." "Has there been a breach?" Marcus asked, his tone instantly shifting into crisis mode. "A massive one," I replied. "I also need you to sever all automated clearinghouse links between my accounts and Grant's personal checking. As of this exact second, he does not have authorization to move a single cent of my capital." I hung up and immediately dialed my corporate attorney, instructing him to draft a cease and desist regarding the unauthorized use of my company's financial data by any third-party lender. I was building a fortress, brick by brick, and I was locking Grant on the outside, but I was not finished. I opened the corporate expense portal for my firm. For years, Grant had carried a secondary corporate card for emergency travel and client entertainment when we co-hosted events. With 3 keystrokes, I revoked his access. I canceled the physical card, disabled the virtual numbers, and wiped the credentials from his digital wallet. Next, I went through every single shared financial platform, investment dashboards, mortgage portals, utility accounts. I stripped his phone number from the 2-factor authentication settings, replacing it with a localized authenticator app securely stored on my encrypted device. Finally, I quarantined every shared cloud folder that had even a remote connection to my company's proprietary data. I severed his digital limbs one by one. With the bleeding stopped, I needed to understand the scope of the infection. I pulled up the statements for our joint operational account, searching for the initial capital layout for the townhouse. To secure a property of that magnitude, a massive earnest money deposit was required, usually 10% to 20% of the purchase price, but there were no massive withdrawals. Grant's personal checking showed no significant dips. The money had not come from him directly. I ran a script to scrape and categorize all outgoing wires from his business holding accounts over the past 6 months. Buried beneath legitimate vendor payments and payroll distributions, I spotted a recurring anomaly. A series of wire transfers, each hovering just under the $50,000 mark, had been sent to an entity called North Anchor Consulting. It was a vague, meaningless corporate name, the kind used to camouflage black book expenditures. I cross-referenced the dates of those wires with the escrow receipt attached to the bridge loan packet. The timeline aligned perfectly. The earnest money had not been paid by Grant Whitmore, the husband. It had been routed through an obscure consulting payment, effectively laundering corporate funds to buy residential real estate. A terrifying clarity washed over me. This was not a simple affair. This was financial sabotage. To confirm my theory, I accessed the administrative dashboard of our home's enterprise-grade firewall and router system. If Grant was moving money and forging loan applications, he was doing it when I was not watching. I pulled the security logs for the past 90 days, filtering for devices registered to him. The data populated instantly. There were dozens of encrypted sessions logged between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. I opened his shared calendar on my second monitor and aligned the dates. The midnight network access perfectly matched the nights Grant claimed he was out late hosting dinners for Tokyo investors, or stranded at the office running emergency strategy sessions. He had not been out at all. He had been sitting in his study, 20 feet down the hall from where I slept, siphoning my data and building a shadow life on our network. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows across the dark office. The digital blood splatter was everywhere. Any other wife might have printed the logs, driven back to the gala, and thrown the papers in his face. Any other woman might have demanded an explanation, screaming until her voice gave out. But that was not my protocol. Arguing with a narcissist is a waste of oxygen. Confronting a confident liar only teaches him how to hide his tracks better the next time. I looked at the intricate web of fraudulent loans, phantom consulting firms, and late-night digital theft. Grant thought he had won tonight. He thought he had outsmarted me, publicly disarming me so I would be too humiliated to fight back. He believed I was just a wealthy, compliant wife who would eventually sign whatever papers he placed in front of me to keep the peace. I reached out and quietly closed the laptop. The room plunged into absolute darkness. My rule was simple. I would not say a word. I would let him bask in his fabricated victory. I would let him continue to lie, continue to spend, and continue to sign his name on fraudulent documents. I would give him all the rope he needed, allowing him to weave every single red thread until it formed a complete, inescapable map of his own destruction. The hunt had officially begun. The silence of my home office at 3 o'clock in the morning was absolute. The soft blue light from my 3 massive monitors washed over the mahogany desk, illuminating the digital autopsy I was performing on my husband's life. I had the name of the shell company, North Anchor Consulting. It sounded robust, dependable, exactly the kind of corporate entity that blended seamlessly into a quarterly expense report. But in the world of risk advisory, names meant nothing. Data was the only currency that mattered. Because I had overseen the initial restructuring of Grant's firm 5 years ago, my administrative credentials for his enterprise software had never been revoked. He was always too focused on the spotlight to understand the plumbing of his own business. I bypassed the standard login portal and accessed the master ledger through the back-end database. I queried the vendor database for North Anchor Consulting. The results populated in a neat chronological spreadsheet. The company had no physical address listed, only a commercial mail receiving agency located in a strip mall in Delaware. There were no phone numbers, no names of managing partners, and no website linked to the vendor profile. It was a ghost. I opened the invoice history. Over the past 8 months, North Anchor had submitted 24 invoices. I scrutinized the line items. They billed for strategic demographic alignment, synergistic market research, and localized brand integration. It was pure corporate word salad. It was the kind of vague, intangible service that produced no physical deliverables, making it impossible for a casual observer to verify if any actual work had been performed. But it was the amounts that caught my attention. The numbers were remarkably precise: $49,500, $49,800, $49,950. Every single invoice hovered just inches below the $50,000 mark. I felt a cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. I knew exactly why that number was significant. When I helped draft Grant's corporate bylaws, I instituted a strict financial control mechanism. Any vendor payment of $50,000 or more required an automatic flag and a secondary sign-off from the Board of Directors Audit Committee. By keeping the invoices just under that threshold, the payments stayed within Grant's discretionary approval limit. It was a classic structuring technique, designed to siphon capital slowly and steadily without ever triggering the mandatory internal alarms. I dug deeper into the metadata of the ledger entries. Every financial system records exactly who inputs a request and who authorizes it. I clicked on the digital footprint for the very first North Anchor invoice. The alphanumeric employee identification code attached to the data entry belonged to the Director of Partnerships, Paige. She was the one generating the fake invoices and pushing them into the system. And the digital signature that approved the payout, bypassing any secondary review, belonged to Grant. They were operating a closed loop. She requested the money. He approved it, and the corporate treasury blindly paid it out. I needed to know where the money went after it hit the Delaware Shell Company. I could not directly access North Anchor's bank accounts without a subpoena, but I could trace the downstream flow through adjacent vendors. I pulled the property records for the Beacon Hill townhouse and checked the municipal permit database. An active interior renovation permit had been filed 2 months ago by a boutique firm called Elevate Staging and Design. I cross-referenced Elevate's billing accounts with Grant's corporate ledger. There were no direct payments from his firm to the staging company. But when I hacked into the open-source directory of Elevate's public client portal, I found a matching project code. The billing party for the Beacon Hill renovation was not Grant Whitmore. It was North Anchor Consulting. The pieces locked into place with terrifying precision. Grant was taking money from his company's investors, routing it through fake invoices generated by his mistress, and using that stolen capital to buy imported rugs, custom cabinetry, and velvet drapery for their secret townhouse. I returned to the massive bridge loan packet I had intercepted earlier. Grant had submitted my personal asset reports to the Manhattan lender to artificially inflate his net worth and secure the financing. But there was a missing link. To process a loan of that magnitude, the lender required verified, digitally signed tax transcripts. I downloaded the original PDF file of the loan application and opened the advanced document properties. The visible text can be manipulated, but the hidden metadata embedded in the file's code is an immutable fingerprint. The author tag had been scrubbed, but the device identifier remained intact. It was a unique alphanumeric string representing the specific machine used to compile and sign the document. I logged into my home's commercial-grade internet router and ran a search for that specific machine address against our historical access logs. The system returned a match. The device was a tablet. It had connected to our guest wireless network on a Tuesday afternoon. Roughly 4 weeks ago, it had remained connected for exactly 3 hours and 45 minutes. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. Grant was in Chicago that Tuesday. I was downtown at my office. The house had been empty, or so I thought. Grant had given her the security gate code. Paige had been inside my house. She had sat in my living room, perhaps drank from my glassware, connected to my network, and meticulously compiled my private financial life to fund her own future. She had stolen my digital identity from the comfort of my own sofa. I opened a new tab and accessed the Human Resources directory for Grant's firm. I needed to establish the exact timeline. I scrolled through the personnel announcements until I found the press release detailing Paige's promotion. She was elevated to the role of Director of Partnerships exactly 8 months and 12 days ago. I checked the state registry records for Delaware. The articles of incorporation for North Anchor Consulting were filed exactly 14 days after her promotion. The first fraudulent invoice was submitted to the Treasury Department just 10 days after that. The picture was complete. This was not a cliché story of a successful man buying his mistress diamond tennis bracelets with his year-end bonus. This was an organized, systemic embezzlement operation. Grant had weaponized his authority, and Paige had acted as his willing accomplice. They had constructed a sophisticated machine to defraud his investors, using fake vendors and falsified sponsorship files. It was wire fraud. It was corporate malfeasance on a federal level. If this were simply an affair, the worst Grant would face was a bitter divorce and a division of assets. But this was a crime. When this detonated, the blast radius would decimate everything connected to him. The board of directors would fire him, the investors would sue him, and the regulatory agencies would dismantle his life piece by piece. And I absolutely refused to let Chapman Risk Advisory become collateral damage. I did not reach for my phone to call him. I did not draft an angry text message. Confronting him now would only give him the opportunity to destroy the evidence, delete the servers, and concoct a plausible defense. Instead, I opened a heavily encrypted, off-the-grid communication channel that connected directly to the general counsel of my own firm. I began to type, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with cold, ruthless efficiency. The subject line read, "Highly confidential, anticipated legal exposure regarding Whitmore Holdings. Immediate action required." I drafted a comprehensive legal memorandum. I instructed my counsel to immediately sever any remaining advisory contracts we held with Grant's firm. I ordered the creation of a strict legal firewall, completely isolating our corporate assets, our intellectual property, and our client lists from any entity associated with my husband. I directed my team to prepare a preemptive audit of our own books, ensuring that not a single cent of Chapman money had accidentally commingled with the North Anchor fraud. I hit send. The message encrypted and vanished into the digital void. I had secured my perimeter. I had protected my life's work. I looked at the folder on my desktop, now overflowing with system logs, metadata reports, and fraudulent invoices. The townhouse was not a gift. It was a crime scene, and I was the only one holding the evidence. The espresso machine hummed a low, steady baritone, the only sound in the cavernous white marble kitchen. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I sat at the center island, dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and matching trousers, sipping black coffee. My posture was perfect. My pulse was a flat, resting 60 beats per minute. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, sending a faint vibration through the floorboards. Heavy. Hurried footsteps echoed across the herringbone hardwood, growing louder until Grant rounded the corner. His tuxedo from the previous night was gone, replaced by a bespoke cashmere sweater and designer denim, but his face carried the frantic, tight expression of a man who had just hit a brick wall at full speed. His jaw was clenched so tightly a vein throbbed near his temple. "Turn them back on," Grant demanded. Not as a greeting, but as a command. He threw his leather wallet onto the marble island. It slid across the smooth surface and hit my coffee saucer with a sharp clatter. "Turn the cards back on right now. Harper." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. I did not look at the wallet. I just had to leave Paige sitting at a table at Contessa in the back bay, because my corporate platinum card was declined for a $200 breakfast, he snapped, his voice rising in pitch, entirely shedding his polished gala persona. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? The waiter looked at me like I was a tourist. I had to call my assistant to wire funds directly to the restaurant manager. "You need to stop acting crazy and fix this immediately." He was pacing now, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was waiting for me to yell. He was waiting for the emotional explosion he thought he had earned the night before. "I have a massive public relations crisis to manage this morning because you decided to stage a dramatic walkout instead of playing your part," Grant continued, adopting the smooth, persuasive cadence he used to negotiate with hostile board members. "You are blowing the entire presentation out of proportion. The key handover was brand storytelling. It was a visual metaphor for our investors. The Beacon Hill property is not a personal home. Harper, it is a hospitality asset. It is a staging ground for executive retreats and high-level client acquisitions. It has absolutely zero personal significance." I placed my coffee cup down. The ceramic clicked against the saucer. The quiet sound seemed to freeze him in place. I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not tell him how insulting his brand storytelling excuse was. I simply reached into the leather portfolio resting beside my elbow and withdrew a stack of meticulously organized papers. I slid the first document across the island. It was the printed bridge loan application. Opened directly to the page where my personal tax identification number and liquid asset summary were listed as the primary guarantor. Grant looked down. The color began to drain from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen undertone beneath his expensive tan. I slid the second document forward. It was a printed spreadsheet, highlighting the network access timestamps, cross-referenced with his alleged business trips, proving the precise moments my digital security was breached from within our own walls. Finally, I placed the third piece of paper on top. It was the vendor reconciliation sheet, drawing a bold, undeniable line between his treasury payouts to the Phantom consulting firm and the interior design invoices for the hospitality asset he had just lied about. Grant stared at the papers. For exactly 4 seconds, the silver-tongued visionary was completely paralyzed. His mind was frantically trying to calculate how a woman who had walked out of a ballroom empty-handed at 10 o'clock at night had entirely deconstructed his shadow life by 8 o'clock the next morning. But a narcissist never surrenders. They simply change their angle of attack. Grant straightened his posture, puffing his chest out to reclaim his physical dominance in the room. He let out a condescending scoff, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a confused intern. "You are looking at standard operating procedures and reading a conspiracy into them," Grant said, his voice dropping into a patronizing register. "You run a boutique risk firm, Harper. You do not understand how large-scale real estate development and Tier 1 venture financing actually work. Capital has to be fluid. We use vendor structuring to expedite project timelines without getting bogged down in red tape. It is standard industry practice. If you actually understood the mechanics of my business, you would not be sitting here playing detective with my expense reports." "Good morning." The sharp, aristocratic voice sliced through the kitchen. I did not flinch. I did not even turn my head. I knew the cadence of those footsteps. Elaine Whitmore had let herself in through the side garden entrance, holding a designer handbag like a weapon. She walked directly to her son, placing a protective hand on his cashmere-clad arm, positioning herself as a physical barrier between us. "I warned you, Grant," Elaine said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. "I told you this is what happens when you marry a woman who treats a marriage like a balance sheet. Look at her, sitting there like a block of ice. No tears, no heartbreak. Just calculating her next move." Elaine took a step closer to the island, her chin tilted up in absolute defiance. "You brought this entirely on yourself. Harper, you are too cold. You are too rigid. You gave this family nothing but your ambition. You pushed an incredibly driven, passionate man into the arms of a woman who actually knows how to admire him. Paige understands how to nurture a man of Grant's stature. You only know how to audit him, and now, instead of reflecting on your own failures as a wife, you are throwing a tantrum and freezing his accounts like a spiteful child." I let her speak. I let her fill the room with her venom. Every single word Elaine uttered was a gift. She was proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Whitmore family was not horrified by the betrayal. They were not ashamed of the public humiliation they had inflicted upon me. They were only shocked and offended that I had not immediately dropped to my knees and accepted my designated role as the collateral damage in Grant's grand narrative. Grant, bolstered by his mother's aggressive defense, leaned over the marble island. The charming mask was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, venomous sneer. "Listen to me very carefully," Grant warned, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You are going to unlock my accounts, and you are going to destroy whatever paranoid files you think you have compiled. If you dare to make a scene out of this, if you even think about going to my board or my investors, I will crush you. I will spin a narrative so fast your head will spin. I will tell the entire financial district that the pressure of running your little agency has caused a severe mental breakdown. I will tell them you are unstable, clinically paranoid, and suffering from delusions driven by baseless jealousy. I will make sure every single client you have doubts your sanity before lunch. You will be ruined." He stood up straight, crossing his arms, waiting for my capitulation. He truly believed he had the upper hand. He believed his charisma and his family's societal weight could bulldoze over my data. I looked at Elaine, whose face was flushed with the thrill of the attack. Then I looked back at Grant. His eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate kind of power. I stood up. I did not rush. I smoothed a microscopic crease from my trousers. I picked up my coffee cup, walked over to the stainless steel sink, and poured the remaining dark liquid down the drain. The soft splash was the only sound in the room. I turned to face him, leaning my hips lightly against the counter. I looked into the eyes of the man I had spent 10 years of my life with. There was no anger in my chest. There was no sorrow. There was only the absolute, freezing vacuum of total clarity. "You are not afraid of losing me," I said, my voice so quiet, so perfectly devoid of emotion, that the sheer lack of it made the air in the kitchen feel thin and unbreathable. "You are only afraid of losing the right to use me." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the fraudulent loan application and the damning network log sitting on the marble island, right next to his useless, deactivated credit cards. Within 24 hours of our kitchen confrontation, the Whitmore family deployed their chosen weapon: high society character assassination. They could not fight me on a ledger, so they moved the battlefield to the country clubs, the charity boardrooms, and the private dining tables of Boston. Mason Whitmore, Grant's older brother and a junior partner at a mid-tier lobbying firm, became the designated mouthpiece for their aggressive public relations spin. My phone began vibrating by noon the next day. A sympathetic client, the wife of a major real estate developer, called to delicately inform me that Mason had spent his entire morning working the phones. He was contacting our mutual acquaintances, planting a highly calculated narrative. According to Mason, I was suffering from severe financial control issues. He spun a tragic tale of a husband trying to build an empire while chained to a wife who had snapped under the pressure of running her own agency. He claimed I was actively trying to destroy Grant's career out of a paranoid, baseless jealousy over a standard corporate hospitality asset. They were laying the precise groundwork to label me as the hysterical, unhinged spouse. It was a classic, deeply misogynistic playbook, designed to discredit my sanity before I could present my data. While Mason handled the old guard of the financial district, Paige managed the digital front. A former sorority sister of hers, who happened to work in my firm's compliance department, quietly forwarded me a screenshot of Paige's latest social media update. It was a perfectly filtered soft focus image of the antique brass key resting on a slab of imported marble. The caption was a masterclass in passive-aggressive provocation, unlocking new chapters and building empires with the visionary. It was a soft, pastel-colored slap in the face, completely intentional and designed to bait me into a public, emotional reaction that would validate Mason's rumors. I did not engage. I simply saved the high-resolution image, noted the exact timestamp, and added it to the master evidentiary dossier. Grant, meanwhile, was growing desperate in the shadows. His charm offensive had failed, and the reality of his frozen liquidity was beginning to set in. That afternoon, my localized authenticator application lit up with 3 consecutive critical security warnings. Someone was attempting a brute force breach into the secure cloud storage network of Chapman Risk Advisory. I pulled up the live monitoring dashboard from my desk. The incoming Internet Protocol address traced directly back to a luxury boutique hotel downtown, exactly where Grant had booked a suite after fleeing the house. He was aggressively trying to bypass the 2-factor authentication to retrieve legacy files he had seen me working on months prior. He needed leverage, or perhaps he needed clean templates to cover whatever sloppy paperwork he had filed with his Delaware shell company. He failed to realize that his login attempts did not just lock him out, they generated a pristine, time-stamped audit trail of unauthorized corporate espionage. The digital net was tightening, but I needed absolute confirmation on the mechanics of his forgery. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my direct line rang. It was the senior forensic investigator from the Manhattan Private Lending Institution. I had legally compelled their fraud division to examine the origination files of the bridge loan. The investigator sounded incredibly tense, the tone of a man realizing his firm had underwritten a massive liability. He confirmed that the electronic signature stamped across the joint borrower agreement was not a fresh cryptographic hash. It was a pixel-for-pixel duplicate, illegally lifted and pasted from a comprehensive life insurance packet I had routed through our home network exactly 1 year ago. Grant had literally cropped my signature from a document meant to protect his life in the event of a tragedy, and pasted it onto a document designed to ruin mine. 10 minutes after I disconnected with the bank, a second, much quieter call came through. The caller identification was blocked, but I recognized the nervous, rapid cadence immediately. It was one of the associate brokers on the Beacon Hill transaction. He was terrified of being implicated in a federal wire fraud investigation and was desperately looking for a lifeboat. Speaking in a hushed whisper, the broker confessed that the entire purchasing process had been highly irregular. Grant had relentlessly pushed for an expedited closing window of under 14 days. When the brokerage's compliance officer had requested the standard, legally required proof of funds to verify the origin of the massive earnest money deposit, Grant had turned completely hostile. He had threatened to pull the entire deal and ruin the firm's reputation in the city if they did not push the paperwork through immediately. The broker was handing me the timeline of Grant's panic on a silver platter. I had enough raw data to bury my husband, but raw data requires a scalpel to be lethal, not a sledgehammer. I left my office and drove in silence to the financial district to retain Nora Bell. Nora was a legendary white-collar litigation attorney. She was a woman who practically lived in tailored black suits and possessed a terrifying reputation for letting arrogant executives talk themselves directly into a federal indictment. She did not yell. She did not posture. She just listened, waited, and struck when the target had exhausted all their lies. I sat across from her heavy mahogany desk and slid the encrypted solid-state drive across the polished wood. I systematically laid out the architecture of the shell company, the structured invoices, the forged loan application, and the network access logs. Nora plugged the drive into her secure terminal and spent 20 minutes reading the files in absolute, unbroken silence. When she finally looked up, her expression was completely neutral, though a dangerous intelligence gleamed in her eyes. "You have him dead to rights," Nora said, her voice a low, gravelly hum. "If we send this dossier to his board of directors right now, he is terminated by the end of the business day. The lender will pull the financing, and the authorities will freeze his assets." "But?" I asked, knowing she saw the flaw in a rapid execution. "But that is too clean," Nora replied, leaning back in her leather executive chair. "If you strike now, while he is cornered in a hotel room, he will claim temporary insanity. He will blame the mistress. He will tell his board he was under extreme personal duress, that it was a temporary commingling of funds, and that he intended to pay every cent back. He will leverage his family's connections to settle quietly." She steepled her fingers, her gaze locking onto mine. "We do absolutely nothing today. Do not send the memo. Do not file the injunction. Let his brother keep making those pathetic phone calls. Let the girl keep posting her little pictures. We let them proceed. Men like your husband do not lose because they lack intelligence. Harper. They lose because they are absolutely convinced they are still winning. We need him to commit further. We need him to take this stolen asset and publicly bind himself to it in front of witnesses he cannot buy off." I understood her strategy instantly. It was the exact philosophy I applied to severe risk assessment. You do not interrupt an adversary when they are making a fatal mistake. You let the hazard mature until its containment becomes a mathematical impossibility. I agreed to her terms, signed the retainer agreement, and returned to my secure office. The waiting game was the hardest part of the equation, but patience is simply cold anger channeled into supreme discipline. My patience paid off exactly 48 hours later. I was monitoring the quarantined inbox I had set up to catch any residual traffic from Grant's locked-out accounts. A notification popped up on my secondary monitor. It was a calendar invitation, accidentally forwarded by a junior administrative assistant who was still using an old, synchronized distribution list that Grant had forgotten to purge. I opened the email. It was an internal, highly exclusive invitation drafted by Grant himself. He was organizing a private, invitation-only cocktail preview event at the Beacon Hill Townhouse for the upcoming weekend. The guest list was attached. It included his most critical venture capital partners, high net worth donors, and key stakeholders from his firm. He was framing it as an intimate, exclusive look at his visionary new hospitality asset before its official launch. I stared at the screen, a chilling sense of absolute finality washing over me. He was not just hiding the stolen money in the walls of that house. He was about to host a party inside it. He was planning to serve expensive champagne to the very people whose funds he had embezzled to buy the imported floorboards they would be standing on. He was about to push himself completely over the edge, walking right into the center of the trap, and I was going to make sure the door locked permanently behind him. The sky above the Boston harbor turned a bruised metallic purple by 7 o'clock on Friday evening. I remained at the head of the conference table in my glass-walled office, the city lights reflecting off the polished mahogany. I was not plotting a scene. I was running a surveillance operation. 3 miles away, tucked into the cobblestone incline of Beacon Hill, my husband was turning a crime scene into a social debut. Using his executive privilege, Grant had orchestrated a semi-private cocktail reception at the townhouse. He billed it as an exclusive preview for Tier 1 stakeholders and select venture partners, framing the property as the crown jewel of his firm's new hospitality initiative. In reality, it was a coronation. It was the official introduction of his new life, funded entirely by my credit and his company's stolen capital. I did not drive to the property. I did not stand on the sidewalk in the freezing wind, staring up at the glowing windows like a discarded wife. I sat in a perfectly climate-controlled room and watched the entire evening unfold in high definition through a stream of encrypted messages. My first informant was the property's private concierge, a man I had tipped very generously during my initial secret tours of the building. He texted me a series of photos from the lobby. They showed Paige standing at the base of the grand staircase, wearing a backless ivory dress, holding a glass of vintage champagne. She was playing the role of the visionary hostess, greeting investors with a practiced, breathless charm. Hovering just behind her right shoulder was Elaine. My mother-in-law held a crystal flute, nodding approvingly at Paige's interactions, visually vetting the new daughter-in-law and signaling to the old money guests that this transition carried the family's official blessing. My second stream of intelligence came from two minority partners at Grant's firm. They were men who respected the ruthless efficiency of Chapman Risk Advisory and felt deeply uncomfortable being forced into a domestic theater production masquerading as a corporate mixer. They discreetly recorded short video clips from the corners of the living room, sending them directly to my secure number. I expanded a video on my central monitor. The camera panned across the parlor. I recognized the hand-knotted Persian rugs, the mid-century modern velvet sofas, and the towering arrangements of white orchids. The spread on the dining table featured imported caviar, artisanal cheeses, and cases of Bordeaux. To the untrained eye, it was a spectacular display of Grant's impeccable taste and endless resources, but my eyes were highly trained. I cross-referenced the visual data with the vendor spreadsheets I had pulled from the treasury system. The boutique catering service pouring the wine, the florists who arranged the orchids, and the luxury staging company that supplied the velvet sofas all shared a common denominator. Every single one of those vendors had been funneled through the North Anchor Consulting shell account. Grant was not just hiding his embezzled funds in the walls of the townhouse. He was physically serving the stolen money on silver platters to the very people he had robbed. As I cataloged the vendor violations, a new alert flashed on my screen. It was an encrypted email originating from a burner address, but the sender identified himself immediately in the first line. It was a junior accountant from Grant's finance department. He was a 24-year-old kid who had realized he was being used as a pawn in a federal crime and wanted to secure immunity before the ship sank. Attached to the email was a compressed folder containing 6 portable document format files. I opened them one by one. They were internal Treasury requisition forms, all bearing Grant's digital signature. But it was the timestamps that made my blood run cold. They were dated for the morning immediately following the anniversary gala. The junior accountant explained in the body of the email that Grant had stormed into the office at 9 o'clock that morning, demanding the creation of retroactive invoices to cover massive gaps in the hospitality budget. He was desperately trying to patch the holes in his ledger, backdating expenses to justify the sudden drain of capital. This revelation shifted the entire paradigm. The gala had not been a moment of reckless, impulsive ego. The backdated invoices, combined with the months of shell company transfers, proved that Grant had meticulously planned the entire sequence. He had spent half a year building the townhouse as a prop. He had orchestrated the public key handover to maximize my humiliation, intending to blindside me so completely that I would be too broken to look at the math. He wanted to elevate Paige publicly while leaving me holding the financial bag. I picked up my phone and dialed Nora Bell. She answered on the first ring. "I am sending you a locked data packet," I told her, my voice echoing slightly in the empty boardroom. It contains live footage from the property, vendor cross-references, and a sworn statement from a whistleblower in his accounting department with backdated invoices. I need you to initiate a strict chain of custody protocol immediately. Hash every single file. Log the metadata on a secure server. I want an immutable digital fingerprint on every piece of evidence so that when this detonates, no one on his legal team can ever claim we fabricated or tampered with the timeline. Understood, Nora replied, the sharp clicking of her keyboard audible through the speaker. I am locking it down now. The file integrity will be bulletproof. I hung up and returned my attention to the incoming media. One of the minority partners had just sent a new, minute-long video. The camera was angled low, capturing Grant standing by the marble fireplace. He was holding court with 3 senior venture capitalists, his face flushed with wine and absolute arrogance. I turned up the volume on my speakers. The ambient noise of the party faded into the background as Grant's voice cut through the audio track. It is a minor adjustment period, Grant was saying, waving his hand dismissively as one of the investors quietly asked about the sudden public shift. Harper is a pragmatist. She is emotional right now. Sure. But she understands leverage. I have the papers drawn up. She will have to sign them by the end of the week. He took a sip of his wine, leaning casually against the mantelpiece. He smiled, a terrifyingly confident expression that made my stomach turn to ice. She will sign, Grant reiterated, his voice dripping with condescension. Because at the end of the day, Harper cares about her little agency more than anything else. She is terrified of public conflict. She does not want a war in front of the board. She will take the quiet exit. I paused the video. Grant's smiling face froze on my high-definition screen. He thought my silence was surrender. He mistook my tactical withdrawal for cowardice. He truly believed that I was so afraid of damaging my professional reputation that I would quietly absorb the financial ruin and the public humiliation just to avoid a boardroom confrontation. He was using the very people in that room, his board, his investors, his partners, as a shield, assuming I would never dare to breach the perimeter of his professional sanctuary. I closed the laptop with a definitive snap. Grant was right about one thing. I did care about my agency. I cared about the spotless reputation I had built over 10 grueling years. But he was catastrophically wrong about my fear of a war. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my silk blouse. I looked out the window at the sprawling grid of the Boston financial district. He wanted to play his final hand using his board of directors as leverage. I decided right then that I would grant him his wish. The final act of this marriage would not take place in a therapist's office, or across a kitchen island, or through passive-aggressive legal letters. It was going to happen in his sanctuary. It was going to happen under the fluorescent lights of an executive boardroom, right in front of the very people he was using to legitimize his betrayal. I was going to let him build his throne out of stolen money, and then I was going to burn the entire building down while he was sitting on it. By Monday morning, the digital landscape of my husband's impending ruin was fully mapped out across the walls of Nora Bell's secure conference room. We had spent the entire weekend tearing North Anchor Consulting down to its absolute foundation. What we uncovered was not simply a convenient shell company used to hide a mistress. It was a masterclass in corporate audacity and systemic fraud. The entity possessed 0 actual personnel. Its entire digital footprint consisted of a single, poorly coded landing page populated with stock images of generic glass skyscrapers and mission statements that meant absolutely nothing. The registered corporate address was not a prestigious suite in a financial hub. It was a commercial mailbox at a discount shipping center situated between a dry cleaner and a fast food franchise in suburban Delaware. But the registered agent who signed for that obscure mailbox was not a phantom. Nora utilized her firm's proprietary investigative databases to pull the state tax registry. The agent was listed as the sole proprietor of a tiny, relatively unknown public relations agency operating out of Brooklyn. I recognized the name immediately from the extensive background check I had run on my husband's new partner. The registered agent was Paige's former college roommate. This singular data point changed the entire narrative. The 29-year-old woman was not merely an opportunistic beneficiary of a wealthy man's stolen capital. She was a fully integrated, operational linchpin. She had personally sourced the proxy, established the untraceable mailing address, and actively facilitated the laundering of corporate funds. I pulled up the itemized invoices that Paige had systematically submitted to the Treasury Department over the last 8 months. I placed them side by side on the glass table with a separate, much thicker stack of documents I had extracted from the public relations archives of my husband's firm. This second stack consisted of formal, highly detailed funding proposals he had personally presented to a major urban conservation fund earlier that year. He had spearheaded a high-profile philanthropic initiative designed to revitalize historic, low-income districts across the city, successfully raising millions in donor capital. I grabbed a red marker and began drawing bold lines between the two sets of documents. The language was not just similar, it was identical. Entire paragraphs describing synergistic community development, architectural heritage preservation, and structural modernization had been lifted verbatim from the philanthropic proposals and pasted directly into the fraudulent North Anchor invoices. The reality was nauseating. He had not just stolen from his wealthy venture capitalists. He had actively diverted charitable donor funds meant for community revitalization and used them to buy antique brass fixtures, imported Italian marble, and premium catering services for his private, exclusive preview party. He had turned a celebrated philanthropic initiative into a personal slush fund to finance his infidelity. But the final discovery of the morning was the one that turned my cold, calculated anger into a lethal, unwavering focus. I was reviewing the extensive vendor compliance packet he had submitted to his internal audit committee to originally approve the shell company as a legitimate payee. To successfully bypass the mandatory due diligence checks, a new vendor must demonstrate a verifiable history of industry stability and corporate backing. Embedded deep within that portable document format file, right on page 42, was a document that made the breath catch in my throat. It was a comprehensive capability deck belonging to my own agency. It was a slightly older version, dating back 3 years, but it contained all of our proprietary risk assessment methodologies, our highly confidential client success metrics, and my own detailed professional biography. He had quietly slipped my company's pristine credentials into the appendix of the North Anchor application. He had deliberately commingled our brands, using my flawless professional reputation and the heavyweight authority of my firm's name to guarantee the approval of his fraudulent shell company. He had effectively, and without my knowledge, made my agency an unwitting guarantor for his federal embezzlement scheme. Nora stood on the opposite side of the glass conference table, her arms crossed tightly over her tailored black suit. She looked at the red lines connecting the fake invoices to the stolen donor funds, and finally at my compromised corporate deck. "This is no longer just an ugly, high-net-worth divorce," Nora stated, her voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying gravity. "This has crossed the threshold into federal criminal territory. Once this information leaves this secure room, the blast radius will be catastrophic. You are looking at an immediate, emergency intervention by his board of directors. The corporate liability insurers will freeze all operational capital. The private lenders will call their multi-million-dollar notes due immediately. And within 72 hours, state and federal financial regulators will be tearing his entire life apart." She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the cold glass. "If we file the injunction right now, today, we win. But it will be incredibly messy. He will scramble. He will hire a crisis team, destroy the physical servers, and point the finger squarely at the girl. He will claim he was manipulated." "No," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, my eyes locked onto the logo of my company that he had dared to exploit. "We do not file today. If we release the data right now, he will claim ignorance. He will say it was a massive clerical error, a terrible misunderstanding orchestrated by an overzealous subordinate. I want him to own every single syllable of it. I want him to look his board in the eye and legally bind himself to this lie before we drop the floor out from under him." I pulled my heavily encrypted cellular phone from the pocket of my blazer. To successfully spring a trap of this magnitude, the prey must fundamentally believe they are the ones setting the parameters. I opened my direct message thread with him. For 3 entire days, I had completely ignored his frantic threats and his brother's aggressive public smear campaign. Now, it was time to play the exact role they had scripted for me. I needed to be the exhausted, broken wife who simply wanted the nightmare to end. I began to type, carefully selecting every word to project defeat. I am exhausted. The rumors your brother is spreading are actively damaging my firm. I do not want a public war. I am willing to meet privately to discuss a quiet settlement. I will withdraw my security holds on the accounts and step away from the charity boards, provided we can handle this discreetly and you immediately terminate the public character assassination. I stared at the glowing text on the screen. It was the perfect concession. It offered him absolutely everything his monstrous ego demanded. Total victory, my silent, humiliating retreat, and the uninterrupted continuation of his glorious new life. I pressed send. The response took exactly 4 minutes. A man like him could never resist an opportunity to gloat. But more importantly, his extreme arrogance completely blinded him to the basic laws of leverage. He did not want a quiet settlement in a neutral location. He wanted a total, crushing submission. He wanted to strip away my remaining armor and force me to surrender on his territory, surrounded by his power. His reply materialized on my screen, brief and dictatorial. A private meeting is no longer on the table. You made this public when you threw your tantrum and walked out of the gala. We will finalize the settlement tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. You will come to the executive boardroom at my firm. I will have my team draft the separation agreements. Do not be late. I read the message twice, a slow, icy satisfaction spreading through my chest. He had taken the bait flawlessly. By demanding the meeting take place in his corporate headquarters, he was ensuring that the final confrontation would occur precisely where his professional authority was absolute. He fully intended to surround himself with his loyal enablers, using the intimidating architecture of the boardroom to force my hand and make me sign away my rights from a position of profound weakness. Well, Nora asked, watching the subtle, dangerous shift in my expression. I turned the phone around, sliding it across the glass table so she could read the screen herself. He wants to do it tomorrow morning, I said, retrieving the device and slipping it back into my pocket. Right inside his executive boardroom, Nora read the message, her eyes scanning the text before she let out a low, dark chuckle that echoed in the quiet room. He is actively building his own gallows. Exactly, I replied, methodically gathering my files and sliding them into my structured leather portfolio. He desperately wants an audience to witness my final surrender. So, we are going to give him the absolute biggest audience he has ever had. The elevator ascended smoothly to the 52nd floor of the corporate tower, my ears popping softly as the cabin pressurized. The executive boardroom was situated at the very apex of the building, a sprawling expanse of imported slate, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the Boston Harbor. It was exactly the kind of architectural intimidation Grant favored. He loved to position himself with his back to the skyline, forcing whoever sat across from him to stare directly into the blinding glare of the morning sun, while subconsciously feeling the sheer drop of the altitude. It was a spatial negotiation tactic designed to make the opposing party feel small, ungrounded, and entirely at his mercy. I stepped through the heavy double doors at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The room was deathly quiet, insulated against the howling wind outside. I did not wear the armored, structured power suits I typically reserved for hostile takeovers. I chose a minimalist, dark slate gray suit with no jewelry, my hair pulled back simply, my face stripped of its usual sharp makeup. Tucked under my arm was a single, impossibly thin black leather folio. To the untrained eye, I looked exactly like a woman who had spent the last 3 days crying herself to sleep, drained of all fight, arriving only to sign her own surrender. That was precisely the illusion they needed to see. Grant sat at the absolute center of the massive mahogany table, flanked by his chosen audience. He had not come alone to finalize what should have been a private marital separation. He had brought his brother Mason, his mother Elaine, and Paige. They were arranged around him like a royal court, forming a unified physical barrier of arrogance. He had assembled them under the guise of acting as witnesses to my voluntary concession, but the true purpose was glaringly obvious. This was designed to be a second public execution. He wanted his family to watch me break. I pulled out the chair directly opposite him and sat down, placing my thin folio gently on the polished wood. Paige shifted in her seat to my right. She was dressed in a pristine white cashmere dress, radiating the aggressive innocence of a woman who fully believed she had won the grand prize. Without saying a word, she reached into her designer handbag, withdrew the heavy antique brass key to the Beacon Hill property, and placed it directly on the center of the table. The metal made a sharp, deliberate clink against the mahogany. It was a territorial marker, a silent, mocking reminder that she possessed the physical symbol of my humiliation. Grant leaned forward, steepling his fingers. His charismatic smile was completely absent, replaced by the cold, authoritative mask of a chief executive terminating an underperforming employee. He slid a thick, stapled packet of legal documents across the expanse of the table. It stopped mere inches from my folded hands. "I am glad you finally saw reason. Harper," Grant began, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space, "this does not need to be a war. The agreement in front of you is incredibly generous, considering your erratic behavior over the past few days. But it requires your absolute and immediate compliance." I looked down at the cover page but did not reach out to touch the paper. "Outline the terms for me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, perfectly calibrated to sound hollow. Grant nodded, taking my quiet tone as a definitive sign of submission. "First, an airtight, perpetual non-disclosure agreement. You will not discuss our marriage, my firm, or my partnerships with anyone. Second, you will sign a total waiver relinquishing any and all financial or legal claims to the Beacon Hill property. Third, you will step down from your positions on the 3 philanthropic boards we co-chair, effective immediately." He paused, letting the weight of the demands settle over the table. "And finally," Grant continued, his eyes locking onto mine with a cruel, satisfied gleam, "my public relations team has drafted a brief statement for you to release to the press by noon today. It is a formal apology to our investors and guests, attributing your departure at the gala to an unfortunate emotional outburst caused by the extreme stress of managing your boutique agency. You will take full responsibility for the disruption." It was a breathtakingly audacious document. He was not just asking for a divorce. He was demanding the complete and total annihilation of my professional dignity. He wanted me to legally declare myself hysterical to protect his fraudulent empire. Mason Whitmore leaned heavily on the table, entering the conversation to play the role of the aggressive enforcer. "You need to sign the paperwork right now." "Harper," Mason barked, his face flushed with the thrill of the ambush. "I have spent the last 48 hours doing damage control with the venture capital partners. If you do not sign this and walk away quietly, the narrative we have prepared goes nuclear. We will tell every single developer in the financial district that you are clinically unstable. We will say your jealousy drove you to sabotage a multi-million-dollar corporate initiative. By the time my lobbying firm is done planting the stories, your precious little risk advisory agency will lose every major client it has on the roster." Elaine Whitmore, sitting perfectly upright in her tailored tweed jacket, let out a soft, aristocratic sigh, as if she were profoundly bored by my presence. She adjusted a pearl earring and offered me a smile dripping with maternal venom. "It is truly for the best, Harper," Elaine purred, her tone laced with a sickening kind of pity. "You were never truly suited for the magnitude of the world Grant is building. You are too rigid, too analytical. You lack the warmth and the supportive grace that a man of his incredible ambition requires to thrive. Paige understands how to cultivate his greatness. You should just be grateful we are allowing you to leave with your private accounts intact." Take the graceful exit, dear. Do not embarrass yourself further. I sat in absolute silence. I did not defend my agency to Mason. I did not respond to Elaine's pathetic, outdated insults. I did not even look at the brass key resting in front of Paige. Instead, I looked at each of them, one by one. I cataloged Mason's sweaty desperation, Elaine's hollow elitism, Paige's manufactured innocence, and finally, Grant's blinding, catastrophic narcissism. I looked at them the exact same way I looked at data points on a risk assessment matrix. I was mentally marking the exact position of every single chess piece on the board, waiting for the final configuration to lock into place. They were so loud. They were so desperate to project power that they completely failed to realize they were sitting in a soundproof room, actively confessing to extortion. Grant tapped a silver pen against the top of the settlement agreement, growing impatient with my silence. We do not have all morning. Harper. I have a board meeting in 45 minutes to formally approve the new hospitality budgets. Pick up the pen and sign the document. I finally moved. I did not reach for his silver pen. I slowly reached out and placed my hand flat on top of the incredibly thin leather folio I had brought with me. I let my shoulders relax, straightening my spine until my posture was absolutely perfect. The illusion of the broken, defeated wife evaporated from the room in a single, terrifying second. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to plummet. Mason stopped leaning on the table. Elaine's smug smile faltered. Grant's eyes narrowed, a microscopic flicker of confusion breaking through his authoritative facade. I looked directly into Grant's eyes, my expression a mask of pure, absolute zero. Before I touch this agreement, I said, my voice no longer a hollow whisper, but a sharp, resonant blade cutting cleanly through the heavy air of the executive suite. I have exactly one question for you, Grant, and I want you to answer it clearly for the record. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds, ensuring that every single person in the room was hanging on my next breath. Are you absolutely sure, I asked, pronouncing every single syllable with lethal, forensic precision, that you want to repeat, right here, in front of all these witnesses, that the Beacon Hill townhouse, the associated vendors, and the entire cash flow funding this new chapter of yours are entirely 100% legal? Grant did not even flinch. The sheer magnitude of his hubris provided him with an impenetrable armor against reality. He leaned back in his plush leather executive chair, a condescending smirk playing on his lips, treating my question like the desperate, pathetic grasping of a defeated woman who was completely out of her depth. Every single dollar is accounted for, Grant stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. Every vendor is fully compliant with our corporate treasury protocols. The acquisition of the hospitality asset was executed perfectly within the legal frameworks of this firm. You are simply trying to weaponize your bruised ego and spin a narrative of financial conspiracy because you cannot accept the reality of our separation. Everything is entirely legal. Paige leaned closer to him, emboldened by his unwavering confidence. She adjusted the cuffs of her pristine white dress and offered me a look of practiced, patronizing sympathy. I merely executed my professional duties as the director of partnerships, Paige chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. The property acquisition was a mature, strategic business decision for the new chapter of the firm. I facilitated the vendor contracts precisely as instructed. It has absolutely nothing to do with whatever dirty money fantasies you're inventing to cope with your heartbreak. Mason let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed loudly off the glass walls. Stop stalling and sign the paper. Harper, he sneered, rapping his knuckles aggressively against the mahogany table. You are embarrassing yourself. I have spent the last 48 hours doing damage control, and my patience is gone. Just sign the settlement and keep whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left before we destroy it entirely. At the far end of the table, Elaine sat perfectly rigid, her chin tilted upward, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked exactly like an ancient monarch preparing to oversee the final, bloody abdication of a rival queen. waiting eagerly for the ink to dry on my total surrender. I did not break eye contact with my husband. Slowly, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and withdrew my cellular phone. I did not attempt to conceal my actions. I placed the device squarely in the center of the table, right next to his ridiculous settlement agreement. With a deliberate, measured tap of my index finger, I activated the voice recording application. The screen illuminated the faces around me with a harsh, clinical glow, a small red circle pulsing steadily on the digital display. "Let us be absolutely precise, then," I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion, dropping into a tone of chilling, forensic neutrality. "Since you are so confident in your legal frameworks, I invite you to confirm one specific detail for the record. State right now, in front of your mother, your brother, and your partner, that the electronic signature applied to the private bridge loan application used to secure the property was submitted with my full, explicit consent." The pulsing red light of the recorder should have been a massive, screaming warning sign to any rational human being. Any decent corporate lawyer would have thrown themselves across the table to silence the device. But Grant was completely intoxicated by his perceived dominance. He saw the recording device not as a trap, but as my pathetic attempt to salvage a moral victory for my future divorce attorney. He wanted to crush me so completely that he would happily lie on the record just to prove his absolute power over the narrative. "You knew about the financing from the very beginning," Grant declared, leaning into the microphone, his voice booming with fabricated authority. "We discussed the asset allocation months ago. You gave me full authorization to utilize our joint portfolio for the underwriting process, and you approved the digital signatures. You are only changing your story right now because your feelings are hurt and you want to cause a scene to punish me. You consented to every single signature and every single vendor. The trap was set. The jaws had snapped shut. He had just committed federal perjury, fraud, and misrepresentation on a crystal clear, high-definition audio file, completely voluntarily. I unclasped the thin black leather folio resting in front of me. I did not pull out a counter-settlement. I did not pull out a tearful letter of apology. I extracted exactly 2 pieces of paper. The first was the printed access log from the property concierge, detailing the exact times and dates Page and Grant had entered the building under the guise of fake vendor meetings, proving their physical presence during the timeline of the fraud. The second was a single, highly condensed timeline sheet mapping the exact flow of cash from the charitable donor funds, through the shell company, straight into the staging and renovation accounts. I placed the 2 sheets of paper face up on top of his settlement agreement. It was my final warning. It was the absolute last opportunity for him to look at the data, read the vendor names, and realize that he was walking blindfolded into a minefield of his own creation. Grant actually scoffed. He glanced down at the papers, but his extreme arrogance prevented him from actually absorbing the catastrophic information printed on them. His ego rationalized the evidence in real time, convincing himself that these were simply isolated documents I had somehow scavenged. A weak, pathetic intimidation tactic from a woman who lacked the courage and the capital to actually use them. Instead of panicking, he grabbed his heavy silver pen. He flipped to the final addendum page of his settlement document, which formally ratified all of his verbal statements, confirmed the legality of the asset acquisition, and bound him to his own lies. He slashed his signature aggressively across the bottom line. He pushed the thick packet back toward me, the black ink still gleaming wet under the harsh boardroom lights. "Your turn," Grant commanded, leaning back in his chair with a triumphant, victorious exhale. Crossing his arms over his chest, I looked at his fresh signature. I looked at the pulsing red light of the recording application. I reached out and stopped the recording. The red light vanished. I picked up my phone, sliding it smoothly back into my blazer pocket. I gave him a very slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if I had finally extracted the exact concession I had come for all along. "Good," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, razor-sharp whisper that seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the massive room. "I just needed you to lie one more time in writing." Grant's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Mason opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but the words never materialized. Before Grant could process the absolute finality of my statement, before Paige could gloat about her brass key, and before Elaine could let out another condescending sigh, a deafening sound shattered the quiet tension of the room. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom did not open with the soft, apologetic click of an administrative assistant bringing a fresh pot of coffee. They swung open with a massive, echoing crash, hitting the rubber stoppers on the glass wall with the violent force of a battering ram. The manufactured silence in the room evaporated instantly. Grant snapped his head toward the entrance, the arrogant smirk melting completely off his face, replaced by a pale mask of sudden confusion. Paige gasped out loud, her hands instinctively clutching the edge of the mahogany table. 4 people stepped over the threshold, moving in a synchronized, unrelenting formation of absolute corporate destruction. Leading the charge was Nora Bell. She wore her signature tailored black suit, carrying a massive, steel-reinforced litigation briefcase that looked heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Flanking her right side was Celeste Avery, the fiercely intimidating, gray-haired chairwoman of the board of directors for Grant's firm. Celeste's face was locked in an expression of unadulterated, lethal fury. To Nora's left stood the senior independent auditor from the city's most ruthless accounting firm, clutching a thick stack of forensic ledgers covered in red flags. And bringing up the rear, his face a rigid mask of legal liability, was the lead fraud investigator representing the massive insurance conglomerate that backed the Urban Conservation Project. They did not pause. They did not wait for an invitation to enter the sanctuary. They marched straight toward the mahogany table, bringing the full, crushing weight of reality down upon the architect of my ruined marriage. Celeste Avery marched to the head of the mahogany table, completely ignoring the stunned expressions of my husband and his family. The chairwoman of the board did not sit down. She placed her hands flat on the polished wood and delivered the fatal blow. "This is no longer a personal settlement negotiation," Celeste announced, her voice slicing through the heavy air of the executive suite like a guillotine. "I am officially convening an emergency disciplinary session of the board of directors. We have been presented with preliminary, undeniable evidence of vendor fraud, gross misrepresentation to private lenders, and the catastrophic misuse of philanthropic donor funds." Grant's face lost every drop of its color. He opened his mouth to deploy his usual charismatic defense, but Nora Bell did not give him the oxygen. She walked straight to the media console embedded in the wall. Within seconds, the massive high-definition screen behind Grant illuminated, casting a harsh blue glare over his shoulders. It displayed a terrifyingly clear, irrefutable cash flow diagram. "Let us trace the capital," Nora stated, her gravelly voice commanding absolute attention. She picked up a laser pointer, guiding the room through the anatomy of the crime. She traced the flow of capital directly from the Urban Conservation Project accounts to the North Anchor Consulting shell entity. From there, the red line splintered, bleeding out to luxury staging companies, elite event furnishings, premium catering, and finally, settling directly onto the Beacon Hill property and the personal luxury expenses of Grant and his partner. The senior independent auditor stepped forward, slamming his thick red-flagged ledger onto the table. He did not mince words. He laid out the digital forensics. He detailed exactly how the fraudulent invoices were generated, explicitly citing the Internet protocol address of my home network. He exposed the highly illegal, unauthorized integration of Chapman Risk Advisory's proprietary corporate deck into the vendor approval packets. "Furthermore," the auditor continued, glaring down at Grant, "you utilized your wife's personal financial identity without any legal authorization to secure a multi-million-dollar private loan, artificially inflating your asset column to bypass underwriting scrutiny." The fraud investigator representing the massive insurance conglomerate was next. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression radiating absolute institutional hostility. "The incident has already been escalated to our Federal Compliance Division," the investigator confirmed. "We have officially warned the Manhattan Lending Institution, regarding the fraudulent origin of your earnest money and the severe misrepresentation on your joint application. The closing on the Beacon Hill townhouse has been frozen immediately. The capital is locked. The walls completely collapsed. The brilliant, visionary executive vanished, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, cornered thief. Grant panicked. His survival instinct overrode any lingering loyalty or manufactured romance. He spun around in his plush leather chair and pointed a trembling finger directly at Paige. "She did this," Grant stammered, his voice cracking, entirely shedding his polished baritone. "She was the director of partnerships. She is the one who sourced the vendors and managed the regional accounts. I just signed the administrative paperwork she put in front of me. I had absolutely no idea the funds were being diverted." It was a breathtaking display of cowardice. But Nora Bell was a predator who loved watching her prey squirm. She smiled a cold, terrifying smile. Nora tapped her tablet. The crisp, high-definition audio file of Grant proudly confessing his complete control over the finances during our kitchen confrontation played over the boardroom's surround sound speakers, as his own arrogant voice echoed off the glass walls. Nora tossed the printed login logs, the internal Treasury emails, and pointed directly to the settlement agreement Grant had aggressively signed exactly 3 minutes ago. Paige was the first to completely shatter. The illusion of her triumphant new chapter evaporated. Her pristine white cashmere dress suddenly looked like a straitjacket. She burst into hysterical tears, her hands covering her face, the polished, confident persona dissolving into pure, unadulterated terror. "He told me to do it," Paige sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly in the room. She pointed right back at the man she had proudly stood beside at the gala. "He gave me the paperwork. He told me to input the invoices and told me not to ask too many questions if I wanted to step into the life he promised me." Mason Whitmore physically backed away from the table. His face was devoid of color, his mouth clamped completely shut. He realized with terrifying clarity that his aggressive lobbying firm would be thoroughly investigated and publicly tainted by association. Elaine Whitmore was practically paralyzed in her chair. The smug, aristocratic monarch was dead. She stared blankly ahead, completely silenced as she watched the undeniable, catastrophic destruction of the Whitmore legacy in Boston high society. Celeste Avery delivered the final sentence. "Grant, you are suspended from this firm, effective immediately," Celeste declared, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Place your corporate badge on the table. Your access to all building facilities, treasury accounts, and digital networks has already been revoked. Paige, you are placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full criminal investigation. Every single file in this room is being turned over to outside counsel and the appropriate federal authorities." Celeste looked down at the antique brass key resting mockingly on the mahogany table. "And that exclusive little preview party you hosted at the property this past weekend? That will serve as supplementary evidence of you utilizing a disputed, fraudulently acquired asset for personal aggrandizement." 6 months passed. The fallout was absolute, surgical, and entirely public. Grant was completely unhireable. He was drowning under a mountain of civil lawsuits layered on top of a sprawling federal wire fraud investigation. Paige had entirely vanished from the corporate partnership circle, retreating quietly to whatever small town she originally came from, her career permanently destroyed by her own ambition. Elaine Whitmore was forced to quietly sell her prized coastal vacation home just to retain a competent white-collar defense attorney to keep her golden boy out of federal prison. As for me, my divorce was finalized with brutal efficiency. I completely preserved my company, protecting my flawless professional reputation and maintaining absolute control over my financial independence. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when I stood alone on the sidewalk of a quiet, tree-lined street in a different historic district. I reached into my wool coat pocket and pulled out a brand new set of keys. I walked up the pristine stone steps and unlocked the heavy oak door of a breathtaking, multi-story townhouse. It was not the tainted property he had tried to turn into a weapon against me. This was a completely different home, one I had researched, negotiated, and purchased entirely on my own, registered legally and securely under Chapman House Limited Liability Company. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the quiet, sunlit foyer. The air was clean. The hardwood floors gleamed perfectly under the natural light. The silence was not heavy or oppressive. It was beautiful. As I closed the door behind me, locking the world outside, I finally understood the absolute truth. The most devastating revenge is not screaming at your enemies or destroying them so thoroughly that they beg for your forgiveness. The most beautiful, perfect revenge is simply forcing them to live out the rest of their ruined lives, knowing exactly what they lost, right at the exact moment they arrogantly believed they had nothing left to lose. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please leave a comment down below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.